Hello, this time on Sitrep, is the world stumbling into a new nuclear arms race? President Putin has just tested the world's first missile powered by nuclear. In response, Donald Trump ordered a start to testing of US nuclear weapons. Does that really mean deliberate atomic explosions, something only North Korea has done this century? And if the US does break the International Nuclear Test Treaty, could the UK get dragged in by association?
We have more nuclear weapons than anybody. With others doing testing, I think it's appropriate that we do also.
It's scary. There's a very real possibility he is talking about explosive nuclear testing in the United States.
Defense Explained.
What the president was reacting to, it seemed to be all the hype around the Russians' tests of their own systems.
This is grandstanding and power play, wanting to show that they're the tough guys.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
When the word nuclear is said in the context of defence, it is always emotive and sometimes misunderstood, but it does feel like we're hearing it an awful lot more these days, Mike.
Yes, I mean, from a rhetorical point of view, nuclear politics is back on the table, not entirely because of the Ukraine war, but largely through that, because the Russians keep threatening it. They keep raising the spectre of nuclear destruction of some sort or a nuclear engagement as a way of making everybody back off from helping Ukraine resist Russian aggression. So there's a great deal more rhetoric about nuclear issues. I mean, the underlying issues haven't changed for many, many years, but other things are changing around the basic technological issues, and the political rhetoric has certainly changed in the last 5 years.
Well, to help us decode the current nuclear rhetoric and actions, we welcome back William Alberque to Sitrep. William is a former director of NATO's Arms Control Disarmament and WMD Non-Proliferation Centre, and our go-to guy for explaining all things nuclear. William, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thank you. Great to see you.
So how worried are you or not about the rhetoric in the last few weeks?
I'm not worried so much as confused. I think President Trump's statements have sort of wavered in the level of detail. Clearly, his grasp on the technical matters isn't tremendously high. And so when he says nuclear testing, there's been confusion as to whether he means increased testing of nuclear delivery systems like missiles, like you said, Putin boasting about Burevestnik, in which statement Putin also said he was so proud he had the best nuclear arsenal in the world. That stung Donald Trump, who immediately on 60 Minutes on Sunday said that the United States had the best nuclear weapons. Or does he actually mean sort of very, very small nuclear tests that you do for safety or things like that? Yeah. Or does he mean actual nuclear explosions underground like we saw in the Cold War?
I'll tell you what, William, if you're confused, what hope do we have? Hopefully we will dig into this a little bit later on in Sitrep. Before we do that, then, go into the detail on who said what and has done what recently. Let's look at what it all means and explain the context. 1996, the history of the test ban.
Sure. So there's been talks on the test ban all the way back to the late 1950s, early 1960s. The US and the Soviets agreed to something called the partial test ban, which banned above ground nuclear tests. Then they continued negotiating in 1974. They negotiated something called the Threshold Test Ban Treaty that limited tests to 150 kilotons and provided the US and the Soviets with verification means. It didn't enter into force until 1990 because they had to make those verification means more robust so that you could tell if someone was really hiding a really big boom underground. And then through the 1990s, negotiations on a comprehensive test ban treaty to ban all non-zero nuclear tests. So in other words, anything that produces a fission yield, anything that explodes was banned. And of course, that was slowed down because the US and the Soviets were testing up to 91, 92 was the last US test, 1996 was the last Chinese and French tests. And then finally, there was agreement on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The US and the Russians signed the treaty, but according to one of the protocols of the treaty, the United States, China, and a couple other countries have to ratify the treaty before it comes into force, and that's never happened. Now, Russia did ratify the treaty, but then they de-ratified it a couple of years ago as part of their nuclear escalation. There we're all still signatories to the treaty, which means in theory we have to hold to it. And the US still holds Russia and China to account for not testing underground, but it has not entered into force, because once it enters into force, it gets even better. You get to have on-site inspections and things like that. But Congress has always been in the way. The US Congress has refused to sign it because they think Russia and China can cheat. Ironically, by ratifying the treaty, you could find out if they're cheating, but this has been the conundrum we've been stuck in since Bill Clinton signed that treaty back in 1996.
So, Mike, given everything that William's just said, I mean, how well is it working, do you think?
Well, it was a big treaty. I mean, as William said, started with the partial test ban treaty in 1963, which Britain also signed. It was the US, the Soviet Union, and Britain, because they were the only three powers. So we had some sort of role in that. But I mean, as William said, the whole idea has grown since then, mainly because those big tests in the 1950s, those huge tests in the Pacific, they'd done all their tests, so they banned them because they didn't need to do any more. And as they've been able to test smaller and smaller explosives, because the direction of nuclear technology is away from the really huge warheads towards more accurate, smaller warheads. So it was testing the smaller warheads that was the issue, and a lot of those tests could be done underground. And so, as William said, that the progress was to narrow down the ability to test until the CTBT was a very, very good treaty. The two big treaties of the arms control regime was the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, probably the most successful of all, and the CTBT of 1996. And both of them represented big steps in the direction of not denuclearizing the world, that's the wrong way to put it, but as it were, de-emphasizing the nuclear elements to our great power politics, to put it into a box that we could control. And that's what's been breaking down. And the fact that, the CTBT, it's got 187 members, of whom 178 have ratified. But those who have not ratified or withdrawn the ratification include the United States, Russia, China, Iran, Egypt, so that the countries that you really want in it are not in it. That's the point.
Yeah, and then exactly as Michael was saying, the treaty specifically says those countries have to ratify it in order for the treaty to come into force. And so this has always just been incredibly frustrating. And so in order to stay inside the treaty, what the United States and Russia theoretically have been doing, the US has definitely done, is called Stockpile stewardship. This is a program run out of a part of the Department of Energy called the National Nuclear Security Agency. And what they do is they do everything that they need to do without actually having to cause a fission event. They can do the high explosive testing that's part of a bomb. They can do electronics. And then they use computer simulations in order to test whether or not the bomb designs work. Here's the interesting thing. When the United States started Stockpile stewardship back in 1992, the biggest computer you had on Earth at that time was something called the Cray 2 computer. Since then, the iPad 2 is more powerful than the Cray 2 computer in terms of calculations per second. So our ability to verify that we don't need nuclear testing has grown so exponentially that it becomes really hard to make the argument that we need a big boom underground in order to verify that our nuclear weapons are effective.
Okay, so Mike, to that point, if we're not actually doing those explosive tests, how do we know that explosive bit will work?
Well, because you test all of the parts of it. So you can't test it in operational conditions, thankfully, but you test all of the elements. So, and there's simulation testing, and it's normally known as bench testing. So if you test all of the bits, and then you test as many of them as you can put together up to the point where you create a fission reaction, then you've got very high levels of confidence that these things will work if they're ever required to. Now, whether the delivery systems work, that's different, because you're talking about different missiles, new release systems, new aircraft. All those things normally would be tested. But in general, I think the world has accepted that when nuclear bombs or nuclear warheads are created, they will work the way they're supposed to. They're also much safer than people think they are. There's lots of nuclear warheads that have dropped off, or nuclear missiles that have dropped off American aircraft, have been lost at sea, been subject to fires. They don't go off because they're pretty reliable. They will go off when they're supposed to, and generally speaking, they won't go off when they're not supposed to, even though they may create a nuclear problem with creating a certain amount of radioactive debris if they're lost in a way that breaks them up.
No, right. But just to emphasize what Michael's been saying, we also have data from more than 1,000 nuclear tests that we've conducted. The actual physics of a nuclear explosion, this is not new science that someone needs to solve. Sure, maybe you can create some sort of new configuration for a warhead that no one's ever seen before, or you can use the smallest amount of nuclear material ever in a bomb, but that's not what we really need to do in order to have a really safe arsenal that's effective and deters your adversary. You don't need super weird new weapons. We have what we need. Now it's a matter of actually making simpler warheads that we can maintain for long periods of time, that we can rely upon for our ICBMs and sub-launch ballistic missiles and air-launched cruise missiles.
So William, the system as a whole, what tests are done still and how often?
So we do what we're calling subcritical tests. That is, tests with nuclear material that does not cause fission, that is, the explosion. So we're using things like at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. There's laser experiments that see how atoms react at the very smallest levels, see how they would react underneath explosive conditions without actually causing an explosion. All kinds of experiments up until the point of a sustaining fission reaction. And so there are very exquisite scientific experiments that are going on at Livermore, at Los Alamos, and Sandia. Those are the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States. What we don't know is what's going on at Lopnor, which is the Chinese nuclear testing facility, or at Novozemlya, which is the big Russian nuclear testing facility. We know that over the past few years, they've been staffed to operate all year long. We've seen the Russian defense minister and chief of staff go visit Novozemlya over the past couple of years. New schools being built, all kinds of things in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. And there are suspicions that they have been doing experiments that exceed the criticality threshold, that are more than 1 criticality, that cause minor explosions. And I think that's what Donald Trump is getting to.
But William, the system as a whole, from command and control to deployment, those are all tested, aren't they?
Oh, right. So, for instance, just last week, we had Global Thunder 26. This is a massive nuclear exercise the United States does. There's an exercise going on right now called, I think, Looking Glass. What these exercises do is they test the Americans' ability to deploy nuclear weapons, submarines, intercontinental ballistic missiles, bombers, but also all the command and control. So the aircraft that you need to relay commands, satellites. We have these aircraft that actually have antenna that go out kilometers in length, because that way you can send signals that can't be jammed over incredibly long distances, especially to our submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And the exercise called Looking Glass is actually about what happens if U.S. nuclear command and control centers on the ground are destroyed, and we have to rely upon the aircraft to command American nuclear weapons. So we do all those kinds of tests. Then back in October, we did something called Steadfast Noon. That's NATO's annual deployment nuclear exercise. There's a bunch of different exercises that NATO does, including headquarters command. Steadfast Noon is when they actually exercise the NATO aircraft picking up the B-61 nuclear bomb and flying towards target with aircraft and assistance, with refueling, with intelligence aircraft, all that kind of stuff. So yes, the US, NATO, the UK, France, do regular exercises to make sure our nuclear weapons are in peak condition, but also that we have every aspect of command and control, from launch to recall to every possible scenario, exercised on a regular basis.
And Mike, in the UK, there have been 2 failed Trident missile tests. It's not a good look, is it?
No, it isn't. I mean, the famous one in a way was 2016. HMS Vengeance launched one of its missiles, and it went off target. It went off track, and so it was destroyed. I mean, as you would expect, it wasn't following the track, so they aborted it and destroyed it, which they needed to do. And then last year, was it HMS Vanguard? And this was more embarrassing in a way, that the missile just plopped, because when missiles are fired, they're sort of fired. It's like a popgun. They're fired on a sort of column of compressed air, and you see them. They sort of emerge from the sea. And then you see the engine fire when they're above the surface of the sea. So they're sort of pop-gunned out of the missile tubes until they're a certain distance above the sea. Then they fire, and then they're on their way. And this one, the missile engine didn't fire. So the missile sort of popped up on its column of compressed air and then plopped into the sea. Now, in both cases, what the MOD say is that, look, when we test fire these missiles, which we don't do often enough, I mean, it's one every 5 years or so, they should be every time we get a new set of missiles from the Americans at Kings Bay. I mean, one of our boats goes to Kings Bay in Georgia, where the Trident missiles are stored. We give them one boat's load of missiles. They give us another boatload of Tridents to replace them, chosen at random from their store. They just give us a random selection of usually 12, I think. And then we take them away. And we ought to be firing one off every time to check that batch is as good as we expect. And what the Ministry of Defence says is because they're under test conditions, so they don't have an active warhead on them, they have a dummy warhead, and it's that has created the problems. If they were the real missiles in real conditions, neither of these problems would arise. But I mean, the Commons Defence Committee looked at it when I was working with them, the 2016 problem, and nothing that the government said then was very convincing, I have to say. So it does raise questions. I mean, I have faith in the missiles. I don't have faith in the way we're testing them, or the frequency or the lack of frequency with which they test them.
William, those kind of problems that Mike outlined there, does it actually affect the deterrent effect?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think the Trident is an incredibly reliable system. I take Michael's point. It would be nice if of the, I think it's 12 tests that the UK have conducted, that these past two, the 2024 and 2016 ones, had been successful. At the same time, the US tested 6 of these missiles this year, 2 in the western test range off the California coast in April, and then 4 in September. I also certainly hope that there were some UK missileers on board the US submarines, just so that, but it sounds like all these errors, everything that I've read into it has been about how the test was set up, that it was human error in terms of setting up the missile. But look, I don't think that Russia has any illusion that they can gamble that the Trident's not going to work in combat situations. I think they have solid faith in the Royal Submariners to do their job when necessary. But I do take Michael's point. It would be nice to see another test. But mistakes happen. They do. The Russian nuclear-powered cruise missile that you mentioned earlier has gone through an immense number of failed launches. But overall, I think all of us, the US, the UK, the French, the Russians, the Chinese, even the North Koreans and Indians, Pakistanis, have some pretty high faith that their nuclear systems are going to work enough in combat, at least, to do severe damage, and therefore deterrence continues to function despite errors like this.
You mentioned earlier on, William, Russia's new nuclear-powered cruise missile. I mean, look at the test failures they had with that. I mean, up near Archangel, it was in 2018. They had a massive explosion, which fortunately didn't create a nuclear event, but it might well have. And the idea of putting a nuclear reactor on a cruise missile that travels at 600 miles an hour, which is very slow in military terms, right, leaving a trail of neutrons behind it across territories all over the world, is massively stupid, as well as being militarily close to irrelevant in terms of the other forms of force that the powers have. But there you are, the Russians are doing it, and they boast about this missile, but the failures they've had with that are legion. And the Americans looked at this technology years ago and decided it was too silly to be worth bothering with.
Okay, so that is the testing as it currently stands explained. So what did Donald Trump actually mean when he posted online, "I have instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis"? The word start is key here. Is he talking about resuming explosive tests on US soil? And if so, what happens next? Mike, William, we'll get your thoughts in a moment. But first, though, Jon Wolfsthal, who served as President Barack Obama's top official for arms control and non-proliferation and nuclear policy. He's now director of global risk at the Federation of American Scientists.
It's scary. There's a period that the human race left behind in the Cold War when we lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation at almost any moment. And great efforts were made after the Cold War ended in the early 1990s to control nuclear weapons and reduce the perception that these were usable weapons. And we now see a resurgence of these theories and concepts that nuclear weapons are not only useful for tools of political power, but actually usable weapons of war. We've seen it by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, and now we see it by President Trump. It assumes that humans are infallible. We know that they're not, and as a result, it creates great fear
Well, let's focus now on exactly what President Trump said. He was asked on CBS 60 Minutes, are you saying that after more than 30 years, the United States is going to start detonating nuclear weapons for testing? He replied, I'm saying that we're going to test nuclear weapons like other countries do, yes. That final yes, do you have any doubt that he means nuclear detonations?
I do, because I think we've seen Donald Trump long enough, and I actually, unfortunately, grew up with Donald Trump in New York in the 1980s, know that he's not a precise man. He talks in circles. He just reacts instinctively without really thinking or knowing the subject that he's talking about. But there's a very real possibility that he is now talking about, and some of his advisors are going to be pushing for the U.S. to resume explosive nuclear testing in the United States. It's possible, yes.
Okay, so to be clear, the US and other countries have continued to test the delivery elements of their nuclear weapons system. Is there any part, though, of that system other than the actual explosive element which hasn't been in test and therefore could be explained as to what he's talking about?
I wasn't privy to the briefings that Donald Trump got, so I think it depends in part on what he's being told. Our National Security Council that advises presidents, which I used to be a part of, has been completely gutted and decimated. There's no senior official working on nuclear issues at the White House right now. So it's not clear what he's responding to. We test every element of our nuclear arsenal annually, multiple times. From the warheads themselves, there are many ways that you can just test nuclear weapons non-explosively, where you examine different parts of the explosive package, the physics package, surveil the nuclear materials and the electronic subcomponents, as well as the delivery vehicles and the systems that enable the president and his commanders to communicate with those things. We test our nuclear command and control and communication system on a daily basis, multiple times a day. So it's not clear that he's referring to something that we simply have ignored. That's something that happened under the George W. Bush administration, but under President Obama and since, they actually have been quite robust.
So from your time in the White House, your understanding was the only other possible test could be explosive?
That's correct. The one thing that the United States has not been doing, because we don't need to do it to determine whether or not our weapons are safe, secure, and effective, is explosively test nuclear weapons. We do many other things to ensure that our stockpile works as intended, and quite frankly, also will not detonate unless we want it to. And that is a program that in which we invest billions of dollars every year, and that has demonstrated over the last 30 years that, in fact, we know more about our nuclear weapons and how they operate now than when we used to test them explosively.
And in your time personally advising President Obama, was there ever any indication that any country apart from North Korea was conducting or preparing explosive nuclear weapons tests?
The government has stated annually for decades that despite rumors and press reports that we believe both China and Russia are observing a full nuclear test ban in compliance with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The nominee to be the commander of U.S. Strategic Command just testified in front of Congress last week that he does not believe that either Russia or China are conducting explosive nuclear tests.
So is this a decision the president can take alone as commander-in-chief were it to go ahead?
Well, he can initiate that process. We still like to believe we have a legal system in the United States that's functioning, although that's being tested in ways that we didn't expect. The president could order the Department of Energy to resume explosive nuclear testing. It would need funding from Congress, but the president has reprogrammed money in the U.S. government without Congress's permission before, and so he could try to do that again. It would most likely have to happen at the Nevada National Security Site outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, and it's possible that that effort might be subject to lawsuits by the state of Nevada, which is controlled by Democrats, and it's unclear whether or not those would be successful in court. So, yes, the president does have the power to order this. It's not clear how quickly it could happen.
Yes, that was going to be my next question, because he did say you'll find out very soon when he was asked if he was serious. How long could it take, do you think?
It depends on what the president wants and what the Department of Energy would try to do. The former National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, wrote when President Trump was campaigning that the U.S. should resume testing nuclear weapons just to demonstrate that it's willing to do so, to show its strength and seriousness of purpose. The United States could detonate a nuclear weapon without attaching scientific instruments, without getting any useful scientific instrument in a matter of months. It would simply need to bury or dig a large adit in the desert, place a nuclear weapon there, backfill it to make sure that radiation didn't leak, and conduct the test. And that's something that I think the U.S. could probably do safely within 6 months. If, however, it wanted to conduct a test that was useful scientifically to provide instrumentation, scientific data, explosive analysis, that's something that would take several years to design and implement and might not be possible even under Donald Trump's administration.
So given everything that you have said, when Donald Trump talks about resuming testing, it's hard to read that as anything but intent for explosive tests.
I think there are people in the administration and in Congress who will push Donald Trump deeper into the corner that he has painted himself, that you said nuclear testing and therefore we need to resume nuclear testing. That being said, it is also very possible, given the timing of his statements, that what he was responding to were a series of tests by Russia for a new nuclear-tipped, nuclear-powered cruise missile, a nuclear-powered long-range torpedo, and Donald Trump is probably not aware that the United States regularly conducts tests of our nuclear delivery systems. What Donald Trump has shown is that what he wants is a headline and to be able to claim victory. And there are many people in the administration that will show him a way to do that by conducting additional tests of our ICBMs or our missiles or our submarines or our bombers in development without having to conduct a nuclear test. In large part because if the United States does resume conducting explosive nuclear testing, there is much less need for it to spend the billions of dollars it currently spends on high-speed computers, on special technical equipment to detect how nuclear weapons behave and age. And that's money that goes to the laboratories in Nevada, New Mexico, California that senators and congressmen really care about. And so we will likely see this break down into a political battle as opposed to one that breaks down upon strategic lines.
Very interesting. Jon Wolfsthal, really good to talk to you. Thank you for your insights there.
Thank you very much.
William, I was reading a post on your blog a few days ago that said, when I woke up this morning, I was convinced that Trump was talking about more active messaging in the nuclear missile and exercise space. As time goes on, I'm more convinced that he means warhead testing. What are you thinking right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with a lot of what John is saying. If you look at the sequence of statements by Trump, you have the tweet, which sounded like it was more towards systems. And exactly as John said, and as I said earlier in the interview, that this is about Trump feeling stung because Putin was bragging. And it was not just Burevestnik, the nuclear-powered cruise missile. It was also the Poseidon, which is the underwater nuclear-powered unmanned nuclear-armed torpedo that Russia tested a couple weeks ago. And also Russia's big nuclear exercise they conduct every year called Grom, which is Russian for thunder. Putin was there in his camis getting, launch orders and things like that. And Trump didn't do that. So maybe he's feeling a little bit stung. And then Putin gave the speech that said, we have the best nuclear weapons in the world. And of course, then in Trump's subsequent statement on Sunday, November 2nd, he said, no, we have the best. And it's like, okay, maybe that's what this is about. But in that 60 Minutes interview, he uses language that seems to be that he was briefed about Russian and Chinese non-zero yield testing, so small explosive testing that the intelligence community has long suspected that Russia and China are conducting. And this is something that John didn't quite go into. The intel community back during the George W. Bush administration first started making these accusations. They were never really in the compliance report, but starting in 2019, the State Department has reported every year, including under the Biden administration, that they do think that there have been some sort of tests by Russia and China that exceed a zero yield standard.
Even recently, William.
Well, so the 2024 one, which was the last one that Biden put out, the 2025 one, which the Trump administration put out in April. This is an annual report to Congress on the compliance of different countries with their arms control requirements. There's a whole section in there, first of all, on the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, and this is where they discuss whether or not there's been some sort of explosion at Russia and China. There was a direct accusation that happened between 1999 and 2018, and then in 2019 2020, I think the US said, no, it did happen in 2019. And then every year they said that this had to be resolved. And these are very small tests. And there is a question as to whether you can do small safety tests that have small fission releases under the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. That's an issue for argument. But to your question, I'm more convinced now that Trump is looking to say we should at least be matching what Russia and China are doing. So if we think they're doing something that has a tiny release, we should do the same.
And the word is, we think they're doing something. How do we actually know for sure?
So in theory, under the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, if they're doing anything that could cause a fission event, they should notify that on an annual exchange that comes out June 1st every year. And 200 days in advance, they should say, we're going to do something, so that the US and the UK can then verify. They can set up instruments to make sure that it's not a big boom underground. In theory, that's one thing that should happen. The other thing that should happen is that the sides should really have an extensive dialogue on this. I know the Obama administration tried to talk to the Russians and Chinese about this, and the Russians and Chinese have very publicly denied it. And the other thing you could do, of course, is get the CTBT ratified and then demand on-site inspections at Nor and Nova Zemlya. We've invited the Russians to visit the Nevada test site many, many times. We've had ambassadors in there. We've had all kinds of people into Nevada. No one from another country has ever been into Nova Zemlya or to Lop Nor. It would be great if they would invite us in so that we could resolve this dispute.
Mike, there is a monitoring system, though, isn't there? An international monitoring system with bases all around the world.
There is. And the point is, it's impossible to conduct any significant tests underground without it becoming reasonably obvious. And you can have very small tests, and you might be able to get away with it by arguing that it's just a normal seismic adjustment or activity. But in general, if you conduct tests, particularly if you conduct them persistently, it's very hard to keep them secret. And as we've heard, the professionals in the US believe that the self-imposed moratorium on underground testing is still more or less holding. And if the United States does resume testing of warheads, then that moratorium will probably fade away. So we've got the moratorium at the moment. It seems to be holding in most significant ways. It's better to keep that rather than put it at risk, I would have thought.
William, what kind of technology does that international monitoring system use?
So they use three different types of sensors. They use atmospheric sniffers to tell whether or not there's been a radioactive release. They use seismology, so to detect tremors all around the world. And they use, I think it's hydroacoustic, to check for sound releases that can promulgate through water or through rock. And there are hundreds of these stations all around the world, including in Russia and China and Iran. They're in very unlikely places. They're not in North Korea, but they're all over the world. This huge network. And the network also leverages other open source information. It all gets processed through to a really beautiful headquarters there in Vienna. They have this big ops center where they can check. And so if there's a mine collapse in Chile, it shows up as a seismological event. And then they check the wave as to whether it's the type of wave you get from an explosion or from a seismic event or from a nuclear explosion. These all have slightly different seismic waves, but you can cheat. And that's what I think everyone is afraid of. If you put a bomb inside a container underground and you put that container inside a slightly larger container, you can mask what is detectable from outside that container by an order of magnitude. And so that's what we're really talking about here is, are Russia and China not only doing something above zero yield, but they're doing it inside a container. And here you're getting a little bit into paranoia because it's like, well, what kind of test could they do that would be useful to designing new weapons? Right. I mean, maybe some safety testing or things like that, but it becomes a little bit hard to believe that they're doing this and that somehow is going to mean that they're going to be able to announce some new super weapon. It's a little bit goofy. And that's what Michael was talking about. Professionals have said, no, not really. There's nothing that's really happening there that we're that worried about. But the protesting community obviously wants to inflate this as big as possible. And so, as Wolfsthal was saying, they do want to get in the president's ear and say, we should do the same exact thing.
Yeah, the bottom line in all of this is that for years now, there have been a range of nuclear warheads. So, years ago, there were very big nuclear warheads, and we now know that they will work. And now there are some very, very small nuclear warheads, and we now know that they will work. One of the things that's not in doubt in the whole politics of nuclear weapons is the fact that the warheads will work. They don't need to be tested any further.
Right.
And Mike, I was going to ask you, does the monitoring explain the importance of Diego Garcia to the UK?
Partly it does, yes. The importance of Diego Garcia to the United States as well. It's a key base upon which testing can be done, both from the air, doing some of the sniffing, but also ground-based, looking at seismic movements as well in the area of Asia that Diego Garcia is nearest to. Yeah, so it's quite significant in that respect.
If the US does carry out an explosive test, there's an interesting potential implication that Jon Wolfsthal mentioned to me when we were chatting after our interview. Because while the next generation of warhead for the UK's nuclear deterrent will be British owned, designed and built, they will include non-nuclear components, and the development work is being done in tandem with the US. So if the US does a nuclear test as part of this development, are we implicated as far as the rest of the world is concerned?
No, I don't think so at all. I think under international law, it is clear that the UK is not liable for US treaty compliance. It's just not. The fact that the UK might benefit from testing, you would have to show a straight line from those non-nuclear components to a nuclear test to the UK. And even then, it's not a legal case. You might make a moral case, but it would be just incredibly hard to argue that is somehow implicating. Plus, the the UK and the French have greatly increased their cooperation on ensuring the safety and security of their nuclear warheads under the Lancaster treaties. And in the most recent statement that came after the strategic review between France and the UK, they may be doing some more cooperation on warhead development. The idea that this somehow is tied to US testing, I think, is tenuous at best. And trying to make that case, if you're anti-nuclear, sure, you're going to grab that. But if you're on the fence, if you're looking at this as a reasonable person, I don't think you would say, well, the UK is morally culpable for benefiting from US testing, considering that those programs have been closely tied since 1958 with the US-UK nuclear security agreements when they started cooperating again after the break after World War II.
So Mike, assuming that the UK would not be legally implicated if the US does carry out a nuclear test as part of this development, it would be politically hard necessarily, wouldn't it, though?
Well, we'd have to negotiate carefully the sort of wording that we use, that our politicians used, because the United States is in a sort of strange geopolitical mood at the moment, and we don't want to antagonize the United States needlessly, but equally we've got to stick to our own lines. And as William said, none of this has huge implications for the way we see our own nuclear development going, but politically we'd have to be careful, I think, what we said about it.
William, we're also buying F-35A jets to carry US B-61 nuclear bombs. Again, would an American test have implications for that?
Absolutely not. In fact, there are a lot of NATO allies that are buying F-35A aircraft, and I think all of them would continue to buy them. If the United States, as Michael was saying, if the United States in its current geopolitical mood does more things to push it to the extremes in international relations, that might raise some questions. If the U.S. decides not to carry through on some of its arms deals, including for F-35s, that would have shockwave effects, but those effects would be far outside the scope. In terms of testing, no, I don't think this will affect the UK purchase of F-35As for Marham Air Base. I don't see how it could. Again, the U.S. may do more things that just makes cooperation between the U.K. and the United States more difficult, but in terms of nuclear testing, in terms of legal, in terms of the optics, as Michael said, with some care taken in terms of how it's addressed, I don't think this will have any effect.
Do you agree on that, Mike?
Yes, I think this is just another example of something it's almost come out of the ether with Donald Trump, because he's picked up statements and demonstrations of commitment that President Putin has made. And interestingly, remember, he made these statements about testing as he was going to his summit with Xi Jinping of China. Right. And, this is his instinct. What you get with Donald Trump is a sort of a stream of consciousness that sometimes is just gibberish, and the rest of the world is trying to make sense of it. And here we are going round in a certain number of circles ourselves, with the best will in the world, trying to make sense of presidential gibberish.
So one thing I wanted to say, following on something that Jon Wolfsthal had said earlier, the National Nuclear Security Agency, who's in charge of testing for the Department of Energy, puts out an annual stockpile stewardship plan. And in there, they say about their readiness. And they used to have a chart in there about how long it would take them to be ready. And as late as, I think, 2024, that chart said they could do a demonstration strike with absolutely no scientific value in between 6 to 10 months. And they've been saying that consistently since 2011. President Biden, I think it was in 2024, issued new national security guidance, which is classified, but which is referred to in one of these public documents that says that the baseline for a nuclear test that's fully instrumented is 36 months. That can change, however. That was a change from under the Obama administration and under the Bush administration, where it was 24 months. So that can change. So while John is correct that it would take some time, including years, for a full test launch with real instrumentation, that's still within the possibility to happen under the Trump administration. And I would also say that there are indicators that this would happen if this is decided, which is really interesting because Secretary of Energy Wright on Sunday, before Trump went on 60 Minutes, but after the tweet, said, we're not going to do explosive testing. We're going to continue to do sub-zero critical testing. And that's our job, and we'll continue to do that. And that's what the president meant. Of course, bureaucrats get overruled by the president all the time, but it is remarkable that he made that statement. And then when Trump went on 60 Minutes, he didn't say he was wrong. He still said these kinds of confused things. Yes. So I still think you would see a huge uptick of activity at the Nevada test site, even if it was a demonstration site. There would be questions in Congress. This would be impossible to hide. So I do think we are all now watching to see what actually does happen, but we could be 6 to 10 months out from sort of just a demonstration strike. It would still have to happen at Nevada test site. It's the only place we're allowed to do our nuclear testing, but it will be interesting to watch.
So, as well as a possibility of US tests, as we said, there's Russia's nuclear-powered missile, which could also carry nuclear warheads. And as we said, Russia's also just deployed a new type of submarine, which it says carries torpedoes that are not only nuclear-propelled, but also nuclear-tipped and could wipe out a coastline. So, if we come back to the big picture question, are we in a nuclear arms race? Is this talk of US tests a symptom of an arms race that has already started? You're nodding away there, William.
Yes, we're in the middle of an arms race. China has been racing for several years now. And not just racing, as we've witnessed by seeing massive silo fields being built, but if you look into the paperwork, which I have, they've been building a plutonium production capability over the past 30 years, and it's really starting to come to fruition over the past 5 to 10 years. We saw this huge parade in September in Beijing of all new delivery systems as well as their older delivery systems, ICBMs, sub-launch ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, fractional orbital bombardment systems. These are space planes that can go 3/4 around the world and drop a nuclear bomb. So China is racing. Now, admittedly, they're racing from a lower level. They started around 300, 350 nuclear weapons a couple of years ago. They're now at probably about 500. Who knows where they're going to race to? But they've built a system that will create missiles and warheads for decades. Russia, too, has been building new systems for years. The United States is trying to modernize its system, which has not been modernized in decades. So we're running in place. Russia appears to be accelerating, getting ready to get out of the chocks and onto the race course. China is racing. We forgot about India and Pakistan. India is surely concerned about China's nuclear weapons, and I've talked with Indian officials. They're thinking about building up their nuclear arsenal. Pakistan's watching India, because Pakistan and India, of course, have their historic hatreds as well. So I think and North Korea, of course, we forgot to mention North Korea. North Korea is building everything they can as quickly as they can. So we're talking about an arms race that is already ongoing. It's rather the US, the UK, and France who are coming a little bit late to the game.
And not only that, Mike, there are new countries that are considering nuclear weapons for the first time, smaller countries.
Yes, well, I mean, as the United States seems to withdraw its implicit or in some cases explicit security guarantees from its allies are thinking now that, well, maybe we need our own nuclear weapons. So that thought is now being talked about very actively in South Korea. Right. It's even being discussed a bit more quietly in Japan. Other countries in Europe are thinking now about extending what nuclear deterrence we have. Germany is now concerned to try to create some sort of arrangement with France and possibly with Britain to extend our nuclear guarantees implicit to them, because nobody now entirely trusts the American nuclear guarantee. And that's a symptom, I think, of America's new posture in world politics, which, as I keep saying, is moving towards a new isolationism. And I think we've got to remember that, America has been isolationist more often and for longer than it's ever been internationalist. And it is now seems to be moving back into an isolationist stance in world politics. And the effect of that on nuclear proliferation is that it will encourage it. It will encourage other states, for reasons of their own, to go nuclear. States that wouldn't have worried about it before now worry about it quite a lot, quite apart from the North Koreas and the Irans, who deliberately want to go nuclear because they are, as it were, at variance with everybody else in the world.
Michael is absolutely correct. Part of the reason the U.S. gives other countries nuclear guarantees is so that that country doesn't develop their own bomb. We caught the South Koreans trying to build their own bomb in the 70s and 80s, and we actually put missile restrictions on them and said, look, we guarantee we'll defend you, including with nuclear weapons if necessary. And Michael's absolutely right. The times when the U.S. has become isolationist in the past, we have to remember under President Nixon, when he did his turn to China in 1972, the South Koreans were very surprised, and Nixon started talking about removing U.S. forces from Asia entirely, from South Korea and from Japan. He was under congressional pressure to remove all U.S. forces from Europe. So Trump is kind of feeding into those old fears of American isolationism. But it really is the U.S. nuclear guarantee to NATO, to countries like South Korea and Japan, that is meant to limit nuclear proliferation. Even Saudi Arabia is talking about getting its own enrichment capability for uranium. And I talked to some of their officials and I said, why do you want uranium enrichment? That's not economically sensible. And they said, well, because if the U.S. decides not to defend us, maybe we need our own options. So this is sending sort of proliferation shockwaves through the system. And the UK, therefore, as Michael said, the UK and France are coming under increasing pressure from NATO allies to see what they can come up with to sort of offset these fears.
So, Mike, what are the arms control treaties that are in place at the moment? And is there any hope of getting arms control back on track?
It's a very long road. I mean, the arms control regime was the most powerful, restrictive regime in global history, actually, which built up from the 1960s, and it was based on, it was like a pyramid, and at the very top of the pyramid was SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And because they were in place, then lots of other things got into place below it. So intermediate nuclear forces were taken care of, and restrictions, as we've talked about, on testing, outer space treaties. There's a whole series of treaties, anti-ballistic missile treaties, but at the top of it all was the pinnacle of Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And they morphed into START, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, and now we're talking about New START, and all that is left in reality is the top of the pyramid. And the New START treaty is in place until February next year, February 2026. Now, the Russians have offered a 1-year extension, not a 10-year or 15-year extension, a 1-year extension, just roll it over for a year. And the United States has not responded to that offer yet. I'm not entirely certain what status that offer has taken. But here we are 4 months away from losing the capstone that is all that is left of this pyramid of control that was very reassuring. And that was why most of us have grown up, as it were, after the Cold War, after the fears of the Cold War, the 50s and 60s. We grew up with a greater sense of reassurance that nuclear weapons were an abstract problem. They were absolutely last resort. They were absolutely dystopian, end-of-the-world stuff that real politics would never get near to. And we all grew up with that. And in the last 10 years, all of those blocks have been taken away, and we're going back into a world where some sort of nuclear confrontation is far more likely in the next 10 or 20 years than it has been for the last 40 or 50 years.
So if I could just get a final thought to add to that from both of you. William, what we're talking about today, is it an historic blip or the start of a new era?
I think it's neither. I think it's another indicator path that we've been on for a long time. I think we've been ignoring the fact that China is trying to become a global superpower in the traditional sense with thousands of nuclear weapons. Russia doesn't care and doesn't like the system of controls that existed during the Cold War and have been built up since the end of the Cold War. They want to tear everything up. They want to take risks. And so what we're seeing is a reflection of that in an administration in the United States that already feels like detaching from the system and going its own way. So I wouldn't say that this is a new path that we're walking down. I think it's the realization that we thought we were safe hidden in the forest and actually we're on a 8-lane highway and trucks are coming at us, and we better get in the car and get moving, or we're going to get run over.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of my life, my academic life, talking about arms control, and I noticed that younger generation of students just got fed up with it. They didn't want to hear it. They were bored by it because they were concerned much more about climate change, and you can understand why. They see climate change as the great problem of mankind. And my message to younger students coming through the university systems now is, I think you better start taking an interest in arms control again, because we need to somehow to rebuild as much of the arms control architecture or something a bit like it that we had 20 and 30 years ago. And it will be more difficult in the coming era, if only because China is in the picture. And China's not going to stop racing until they feel they've got some equality with Russia and America, at least in terms of numbers. But I think we need to start getting interested in what was a very boring subject 10 or 15 years ago. It may be boring, but it's going to be more important in the future than it has been for a long time in the past.
To me, actually very fascinating, if sobering at the same time. Thank you both very much for your time today, Mike and William Alberque. Always good to have you on Sitrep. That's all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.